Hey, what's up? I'm not sure if you've ever noticed this, but on Death's The Sound of Perseverance, a lot of the songs sound a little bit similar in a lot of ways. For instance, they probably sound a lot like this. Or they might sound like this. Or they might also sound like this. Man, I don't know how anyone's supposed to sing and play that riff at the same time. That Bite the Pain riff is so hard. Or it might also sound like this. So yeah, as you probably noticed, a lot of those riffs really do kind of sound similar. So I'm not sure if you guys picked up on that, but the chord that is in question here is this sus2 chord, which basically looks like two power chords stacked on top of each other. You know, the proper name for this is a sus2 chord, right? Right, because we got the root, the fifth, and then the suspended second. But to me and to my brain, it really sounds more like an add 9 chord, right? Despite the fact that you don't have a third in there to make it an add 9 chord, it just makes more sense to me, right? As most of the time in metal, when you play power chords, right, the root and the fifth, the third is sort of implied or maybe played by lead or something. So keep in mind, these are sus2 chords, technically to be correct, but to me, they just seem more like add 9, and that makes more sense to my brain. So I'm just going to call them these add 9 power chords from now on to make it simple. Now, on The Sound of Perseverance, these add 9 power chords feature very, very prominently, including on the songs from which the riffs I just played were, right? The first time you hear that add 9 sound on the album, that sus2 sound, is actually on Scavenger of Human Sorrow in the bridge section. You know, when the song's going like full throttle and everything drops out and you get that little ominous bass line and then it comes in with the guitars. That's the first time you hear it on the album. And you guys heard me play that, you know, in the intro here. But yeah, if we look at it on Songster, you know, Songster, if you're looking to sponsor anybody, hit me up. Yeah, if you look at it here, right, you can see 97575, right, 864, right, those double stack power chords, that add 9, that sus2 shape, that's all is going on in here, right? And I mentioned this later on in the video, but it really sort of has this sort of like contour of going up and down like a mountain, which is really, really cool. Now, the second time you hear that is actually in Bite the Pain. Now, Bite the Pain is interesting, right? You hear it played in a couple different sections, actually. Very, very interesting. First time you hear it is during this part that comes right after the, you know, the thrash riff. Got to be one of my favorite grooviest riffs on the album, but if you go and look at it, right? If you look at it here, right? You got the 264, and then he does some like chugs afterwards. Right, still sort of maintains that contour of the melody, right? Up and down, though, that chord shape, right? Actually, you know what? I take it back. I think this part might be my favorite riff. It's just so groovy and heavy at the same time. Yeah, so you hear it there as well. So this song, Bite the Pain, actually contains it several times. Yeah, so again, you can sort of see like the contours of the melody, right? Up, then down, then up, then down, right? Really, really cool riff there. You know, like in Scavenger of Human Sorrow, it's a little different, right? Because he's sort of moving kind of all over the place with the riff here. But on Bite the Pain, it really sort of gets at this like chromatic movement of this add 9 chord, sus2 chord that you hear all over the album going forward, right? It's sort of moving that shape just down one fret or up a fret. You hear it all the time, and it gives it a very exotic sound, right? Right, and this chromatic movement of these add 9 sus2 chords is very, very interesting. You might also hear in a lead here or there too. Next time you hear it, of course, is Spirit Crusher, right? Like, I think we all know that riff, right? You hear it there, but it's also in the bass, right? You also hear it in the bass. So even before you get into the song, right, you're hearing that add 9, that sus2 sound right away. But then, of course, you also hear it in the bridge of this song as well. And here he's sort of taking this idea of this add 9 shape and moving it up 1 to the next level, right? Here in this song, he harmonizes it in fifths, right? So playing the add 9 chord. So essentially, right, if you have an add 9 chord that's all harmonized in fifths, essentially then you have like 3 power chords stacked on top of each other, right? So here you can see, right, he does it here. Right, he's just literally playing the 5th harmony over top of it, right? And then if we go to the bridge section, it's the same deal. The bridge here in Spirit Crusher and the one in Scavenger of Human Sorrow really are very similar. And both songs sort of anthropomorphize evil deeds or, you know, anxiety, depression into like a monster. Very interesting, right? Interesting stuff. So the next time you hear it is actually in Story to Tell. But in Story to Tell, it's actually a little bit more subtle and subdued. Yeah, so you hear it right under the thing. You hear it right away. And it's not as obvious as a lot of the other songs. Yeah, 0, 2, 4. And then he plays like a Medjugorje after that. But he really sort of like dwells on that chord and holds it out. You know, really emphasizes that chord as well. I also think there are some add 9 usage in the leads here, but again, I'm not going to dive into that. I don't want to spend all day here. Flesh in the Powered Holes is the next time we hear it. And the Flesh in the Powered Holes intro is interesting as it's there and it plays it, but it sort of dances around. It never really dwells on it like a lot of other things do. And if you look, it's still sort of the same type of up and down contour to all the melodies, right? If you look here, right? 12, 14, 15, right? So he's sort of sliding right around the things here. Very interesting sound here. I love the intro to Flesh in the Powered Holes. You know, if you go and watch my deep dive on it, now we're going to get into super nerdy stuff here, but the intro is essentially like Innocence and before he gets addicted to whatever he gets addicted to. So it's interesting that in the intro here, he dances around that add 9 sound, right? He goes to the minor third or to the octave. Very interesting that he doesn't use it here in the intro, but he actually uses it later on in the song when you get to, again, where everything cuts out and you just have like the clean guitar and the bass with these leads here. It's very interesting. Right, you hear it in the clean guitar here, and they actually hear it again in the bass in the next section. That's what I like to call the relapse into binge, into the hangover section. I got to redo that video, but go watch my video on it again. Really in-depth and interesting song. Has a lot of hidden detail in it. So yeah, it's interesting, right? It sort of starts out similar. The add flat 9 sound there it starts out with. Before then it comes around to here, right? Yeah, right there. You got the 0, 2, 4. So it's definitely not used as much as it is on other songs here, but it's in there. It's in there, and it's in there in the right spots to make it sound and feel like it. Right there, we got the 7, 9, 11, right? So yeah, like it's in there in the bass as well as the clean guitar, that add 9 sound. He's not dwelling on it, isn't the focus like in some of the other songs, but it's still there. And then here it is again, right, in this section. It really is very ugly and dissonant sounding, and essentially it's the person in the story losing his battle and falling right back into the depths of addiction here. So it's interesting that it's playing the same sort of up and down cadence of the melody, right? But it's even more ugly and dissonant. It's no longer doing these add 9 chords. It's doing these, you know, flattened 5 chords with the flattened second. It's just really ugly and dirty sounding. So it sort of takes the idea of these add 9 chords and flips it on its head and makes it even uglier and more dissonant, right, for the story that's being told, which in Flesh in the Powered Holes, of course, is addiction and falling back into it. Really interesting touch there. And the last one I want to touch on is in Voice of the Soul. Now, unfortunately, I can't play any clips of Voice of the Soul, or otherwise I think I'll get ganked right away. Yeah, I just want to point out in Voice of the Soul, he plays the add 9 arpeggio here when it comes to the end. Another interesting touch, kind of just throws some of the sounds we've become accustomed to and used right back in there. Very interesting. Of course, we end on the big add 9 or E or D minor add 9 chord, which basically what is this. There's probably a lot of other sections of the songs that might have this leads and stuff as well. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out here for you guys. Why do all these songs feature this add 9 chord shape so prominently? Why? What's so important about it? And why does it define the sound of this album so much for me? Well, first off, I just want to give a big shout out to Fayan's Dream, my boy. He was actually the one who sort of pointed this out to me in one of our guitar lessons. And then I sort of started to realize, yeah, you're totally right. Scavenger of Human Sorrow, Bite the Pain, Spirit Crusher, Flesh in the Power It Holds, they all really feature, you know, Story to Tell too. It all really features this sound a lot, right? This add 9 sound. But, you know, I'm not saying Death is the first album to do this or like the first band or anything like that, right? These sort of add 9 sus2 chords have been all over the place. But what is really interesting about this album, what really gives it its like signature sound to me, is this sort of like up and down crawling movement of that riff, right? Take, for instance, the Spirit Crusher riff. Almost all the time, it's not played in like the full chord form, right? You know, it's never played like that. It's always played arpeggiated, and it's almost always, you know, played in these sort of like up and down descending motions. Right? That's just 2 of those chords, right? Bite the Pain features something similar, right? But it's going down this time. But, you know, why does it give it this sound, right? This is like really the defining sound of that album for me, this recurring motif that happens, right? You know, that going up and down of these add 9 chords, it really gives it a very specific sound, right? You don't hear the sound very often. It gives the parts that these are played in this sort of like very ambiguous sound, right? It's neither major nor minor. And by playing it in these sort of like half-step movements, it really gives this sort of like very tonal ambiguity. It's hard to find your center, right? You know, for instance, right, it's a Spirit Crusher riff, you know? It's like, it's hard to define, and it sounds very sort of like exotic and dark. Yeah, it's just an interesting sound to it that's very strange, and you almost never hear it, and I've never heard it anywhere else, basically, besides this album, right? Fayance also pointed out that most Death albums have this sort of common motif or recurring theme in a lot of the riffs that's going on, and that's a topic for another video on the other albums. So what's going on here? Why all these chords? Why this sound? Why this shape? Well, to me, I think there's a couple reasons for it. To me, it almost sounds like we're crawling up a mountain, right? The mountain on the cover, right? You know, you go crawling up, right? And then you got to go back down. Yeah, it really sounds like you're sort of like going up a mountain or trudging up some sort of challenge or obstacle, right? And that's the whole sort of theme of the album and concept, which we'll get into in a future video as well. But perseverance, right? This riff sounds like you have to persevere like over top of a mountain or something. That's what it really screams to me, right? This sort of chord shape that gets played so many times. Especially when it's played in the arpeggioed fashion, right? It sounds very like slinky and evil and dark and menacing and exotic, which really sort of fits the cover of that album, right? And then I guess your next question would be is like, Varvis, do you think Chuck purposefully did this, right? The first 5 songs on this album are all like filled with this motif, and then the ones afterwards are not. And I would say maybe, and we'll probably never know, but to think that a guy like Chuck Schuldiner would not sort of notice this at the very least, right? Maybe he didn't do it on purpose, but maybe he thought all those songs sound nice together in a row, right? And then after Voice of the Soul ends with that add 9 chord, right? And then you have To Forgive Is to Suffer, as well as A Moment of Clarity and Painkiller, which don't feature that sound at all, right? So it's sort of like you have the first chunk of the album filled with this add 9 arpeggiated sound, and then afterwards, Voice of the Soul ends on that same chord, and then it goes, right? And it really defines the sound of this album for me. Like, I don't know about you guys, man, but when I think of this album, I sort of intrinsically and automatically think of just like this sound. right? That add 9 sound is just all over this album in the leads and everything like that too. And it's just it just defines the sound of this album to me. And I can't think of another album that has such a defining chord motif throughout. You know, and it's not like it's ever played the same way. It's played similarly, but very, very different. But despite the fact it sounds familiar all throughout, it's very, very interesting. And it really gives just such a unique vibe and flavor to this album that I really, really like it. Right? So you have Scavenger of Human Sorrow has it, Bite the Pain has it, Story to Tell has it, Spear Crusher has it, Flesh and the Powered Holds has it as well. The clean guitar that's playing in the bridge of Flesh and the Powered Holds is actually very similar to that one arpeggiated part in Voice of the Soul. That's also topic for another video. Voice of the Soul also plays it, and then it finishes with that chord, right? If you played it earlier, finishes with that big add 9 chord, and then the rest of the album doesn't have it. So Voice of the Soul seems to be ending that motif by finishing with it and ending on that motif, right? It ends on that add 9 chord. Although this time actually has the third in it, right? When he plays, you know, the 024 000, right, on the guitar. I'll put it in the tabs, you'll see it. So yeah, it's just very, very interesting and very, very unique sound in the way that he structures this album. And in a way, right, I always kind of thought to myself that To Forgive Is to Suffer and A Moment of Clarity do sound different from the rest of the songs on that album, but I always sort of maybe attributed it to them being older songs, or maybe they were like the latest songs that were written for that album. But it really seems like Chuck intentionally structured the album this way, right? I'm not going to ignore the fact that the first more than half of the album has it. Then the Voice of the Soul, one of the most important songs on that record, ends with that chord, and then you don't hear it again. So what is he trying to say here, right? Is this add 9 chord sort of representative of the perseverance, the something you have to persevere, right? This sort of like ambiguity, uncertainty, and climbing over the proverbial mountain, so to speak. Like when you go look at, you know, the contour of the melodies of the Spirit Crusher riff or things like that, right? It looks like you're going up a mountain, right? Up one way, dun 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 dun, right? It looks like you're going up and then down. It's very, very interesting and just a very, very, there's just, oh man, there's just so many layers to this album that even now, after I've listened for, I don't know, man, 1,000 times probably now at this point, maybe less than that, but you know, you still kind of discover and see new things in this album. But I just thought it was just so interesting. He ends Voice of the Soul with that add 9 chord, never uses it again. So what is he trying to say, right? Voice of the Soul ends on a rather happy note to me, right? It seems like it sort of ends on a higher note. It really seems to say like, okay, we're here. That was all the stuff we need to persevere through, right? Scavenger, Human Sorrow, Anger, Bite the Pain, right? Pain, right? Story to Tell is sort of like a, you know, the story of the pain and perseverance. Spirit Crusher, right? This all be depression and anxiety. And then Flesh and the Power It Holds is addiction, right? And after those songs are done, Voice of the Soul hits, instrumental, so it's sort of completely up to interpretation. And then you have, right, To Forgive Is to Suffer, a song about the warning and perils of forgiving people, right? And how we should be careful. Then you have A Moment of Clarity, the last death song, you know, ever put on an album about, you know, achieving this sort of clarity from the noise, I guess you could say, right? And then, of course, it ends with Painkiller, which go see my video I made on the Painkiller cover. Very interesting details going on that song, too. But yeah, I just thought this was interesting and worthy of a little video here. And not only that, but, you know, it sort of like fits in with this overall theme of like perseverance and climbing over mountains and climbing over obstacles. This sort of arpeggiated add 9 riff sort of feels like something you have to overcome, and then you come down the other side, right? You know, I played the Spirit Crusher riff a few times, but that just really comes back to me every time. So then what can we learn personally from this? How can we apply this to our own music, right? You know, obviously, I'm not saying go out and steal the add 9 idea from Death and go do it yourself, but it sort of brings forth this idea of having this motif that's sort of hidden in your music that people can, if they really dive into it, they can see, right? So yeah, I don't know, maybe it could be, you know, maybe you play the same dyads in a row, but in different keys, or maybe you play like the same run every once in a while in the songs, or maybe you have the same sort of vocal chant or vocal cadence, or maybe it's the same drum fill that gets used over and over again. It's just something to tie all the songs together and sort of give the album a sort of total feel, a sort of feel that you're listening to something that's supposed to be experienced as a whole. And that's what this sort of add 9 chord really does and makes this album feel for me. It makes it feel very cohesive, right? You hear these same chords and arpeggiated patterns of this chord, but played in different keys, all over the fretboard, and different riffs, different time signatures, and stuff like that. And it's just very, very cool and very, very interesting to hear how many ways he thought of putting all this together. But was this on purpose? You know, we'll probably never know unless there's some like long lost journal where, you know, Chuck would just take notes and explain his thoughts. But you know, I'm sure there isn't anything like that. But to think that a guy of his caliber and his musical, I'll just say it, his musical genius, you know, to think that he wouldn't notice that and pick up on it, right? And then to have the cover be the mountain, right? The mountain with the gaping maw that these people are ascending up with the red color really sort of gives this very exotic feel of having to, you know, get up the mountain, other side, right? To persevere over top of whatever it is that's blocking your path, right? So yeah, it's just genius, man. I love it. I just want to make this video. So let me know your thoughts on this, you guys, and let me know if I'm out to lunch here. Have you guys noticed this here? Any other artists you notice have done similar things here? I've been Varvis. Cheers.